This is things I wish I could say in Sunday school. I want to share some thoughts and ideas that are different than what we usually hear. My goal is to be really honest rather than inherently faith-promoting. I hope these ideas may spark some interesting discussions with your friends, families, or classes. Please enjoy. This is the lesson for June 16th through 20th and June 23rd through 29th. Today's topics are forgiveness, William McLellin, and the Book of Commandments. I've spoken about forgiveness on this podcast before when I covered 3 Nephi chapters 8 through 11, but it's a major topic again. I'll start with reading Doctrine and Covenants, section 64, verses 9 and 10. Wherefore I say unto you that ye ought to forgive one another, for he that forgiveth not his brother his trespasses standeth condemned before the Lord, for there remaineth in him the greater sin. I, the Lord, will forgive whom I will forgive, but of you it is required to forgive all men. When I was young, I felt a lot of impact from these verses. I felt like I had to forgive people who harmed me, otherwise God would be upset with me. I would be committing the greater sin. It wasn't a very mature way of seeing it. I felt coerced into forgiveness that didn't feel quite right because of the threat in these verses. I wish I would have cared about the context more back then. Here, Joseph Smith is dealing with small conflicts coming up between members of his church. I'm sure many had bones to pick with Joseph Smith too. This commandment to forgive one another, along with the threat, was to quash people's legitimate issues with each other in favor of stability within the institution. It's basically telling people that the church is more important than the individual. I wholeheartedly disagree with that idea. Individuals matter. I believe the role of churches and institutions are to support individuals, not the other way around. So now I ask myself, what real truth is in these verses? I do believe that we shouldn't dwell on petty disagreements. That doesn't do any good. I think nursing grudges is a bad idea. It doesn't lead toward greater peace and happiness. There's a balance with how open we should be, especially with someone who has caused us harm. I fully support cutting harmful people off. No good comes from putting ourselves in a position to be victimized. While I personally like the idea of not being 100% closed off to someone, there's always the slightest chance they could change. I truly don't believe that's right for everyone, especially when there's been abuse. I think the goal is personal peace and freedom. I think that being 100% closed off to certain people can absolutely be the kindest thing to ourselves and to them. Anyway, another thing I wanted to mention, verse 10 says, I, the Lord, will forgive whom I will forgive. That gives the impression that God doesn't always forgive. Or it lets us hope that God will punish those that do wrong. I think both are false ideas. God is not smiting people. That's not real. I also think that for our heavenly parents, forgiveness is a constant state of being. It's unconditional. It's not conditionally granted when certain criteria are met. That's ridiculous. But I definitely pictured it that way when I was young, in large part because that's the way the church teaches it. With my own kids, I pretty much feel the same way. I love them unconditionally. I feel like I would forgive anything they did. There would be consequences, of course, but because of the unconditional love I have for them, the decision to forgive was already made. I feel like God has already forgiven their children. It's already done. It's not something we earn. And lastly, institutions that push you to sacrifice your own well-being for the good of the institution are not to be trusted. William McLellin is another interesting tale from the Doctrine and Covenants. The manual's summaries leave out a lot. He met missionaries in Illinois and was baptized in August 1831. He traveled to Ohio for General Conference in October 1831. Afterwards, he hurt his ankle and asked Joseph Smith to heal it. He wrote in his journal, he laid his hands on the ankle and it was healed, although it was swelled much and pained me severely. I question how much it was really healed just based on his own description. You would expect swelling and pain from a sprain. You just stay off of it and give it time to heal. A few days later, McLellin went before the Lord in secret and on my knees asked him to reveal the answer to 5 questions through his prophet. Without letting Joseph know what these 5 questions were, McLellin asked Joseph to provide him God's will. The resulting revelation is Doctrine and Covenants, section 66. McLellin said his 5 questions were answered to his full and entire satisfaction. Okay, the gist of Section 66 is that McLellin is forgiven for his sins and sent on a mission. It's not a stretch to surmise that McLellin's secret questions were about his own salvation and present purpose. Everyone questions those same things. McLellin took this experience to mean that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God. To me, the message is pretty universal, but I get him having a spiritual experience with it. Psychics and mediums still impress people with cold readings. There's another interesting story with McLellin I'll cover in the next topic, the Book of Commandments. After this, McLellin was a missionary. Then he was excommunicated in December 1832. I don't have any information about the reason for it, and he was reinstated in early 1833. McLellin gets called out in Doctrine and Covenants section 90, verse 35. Joseph Smith tells him that the Lord is not pleased with him. McLellin was one of the original members of the Quorum of the 12 in 1835. He renounced church leaders in 1838 and was excommunicated. The impetus for this was likely Joseph Smith's mishandling and bank failure in Kirtland. McLellin supported Signy Rigdon after Joseph Smith's death and was appointed an apostle in Rigdon's organization. That didn't last long, and he affiliated with some other Mormon breakup groups. He continued to believe in the Book of Mormon the rest of his life, and he died in 1883 in Independence, Missouri. To me, McLellin is interesting because he clearly had strong religious convictions, and he witnessed wrongdoing by his church leaders. He chose to call out the wrongdoing. He made a decision that he couldn't support that. Even though it resulted in his excommunication, it seems like his spiritual conversion never left him in spite of it all. Now I'm going to discuss the Book of Commandments. Shortly after the October 1831 General Conference of the Church, Joseph Smith held additional small conferences, and that's where we get Doctrine and Covenants section 67 through 70, but also section 1 and section 133. The main item of business was publishing Joseph Smith's revelations. They made the decision to print them and call it the Book of Commandments. Section 1 was intentionally placed first, and the rest largely followed chronological order. The Book of Commandments used the term chapters rather than sections, and it contained 65 chapters. What became section 133 was an appendix in the Book of Commandments. There's a lot of crazy stuff in that section, but I'll cover it in a future podcast. Originally, 10,000 printed copies were planned, but then that was scaled back to 3,000. Many people know the story of the printing press working on it being burned by a mob in Independence, Missouri. It's in the LDS movie Legacy. The mob was pro-slavery, and the press recently published something abolitionist. I was taught that the mob was just going after Mormons, but as usual, there were a lot of other factors in play. 2 teenage girls, Caroline and Mary Elizabeth Rollins, saved a large portion of the unfinished book from the fire. The Book of Commandments was succeeded by the first book of Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, just 2 years after its publication. The first Doctrine and Covenants had 102 sections. There are a lot of edits and changes from the Book of Commandments to the Doctrine and Covenants. It's obvious from the changes that Joseph Smith's doctrines were evolving. The most notable change is that the mention of Peter, James, and John restoring the Melchizedek priesthood in Keys in section 27 is not in the Book of Commandments. Peter, James, and John were added years later. Now for the McLellin story. Some of the men were worried that the language of the Revelations wasn't refined enough. They decided to have someone educated attempt to produce a revelation. McLellin was chosen because he was a school teacher. The story is that McLellin struggled to write a revelation and produce something of much poorer written quality than Joseph Smith's revelations. I guess this was to support the idea that Joseph Smith's revelations were real, even though it doesn't actually do that at all. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Please share with family and friends. Until next time.